by Kevin J. Kelly. More by this author. 1 year after his election as President of the United States, Donald Trump has further militarized Washington's dealings with Africa while taking a more unilateral and decentralized approach to the continent. "You're going to see more actions in Africa, not less," Republican Senator Lindsey Graham remarked recently in regard to strategic shifts in the U.S. global war on terrorism. "You're going to see more aggression by the United States toward our enemies, not less. You're going to have decisions being made not in the White House but out in the field." Al-Shabaab. That new policy has been given concrete expression in Somalia, where the U.S. has stepped up drone strikes on targets identified as Al-Shabaab encampments. On November 10, for example, the U.S. Africa Command announced it had killed several Shabaab fighters in the latest of more than a dozen air attacks this year inside Somalia. The strikes became more frequent following a Trump directive in March designating parts of Somalia as war zones and giving U.S. field commanders greater leeway in launching attacks. U.S. soldiers with at least 6,000 U.S. troops now said to be deployed in various African countries. The Pentagon is involved in offensive operations in the Sahel region as well as in the Horn. A total of 5 U.S. soldiers have been killed since May in the course of such actions in Somalia and Niger. The growing reliance on military might in Africa is accompanied by a lessened investment in diplomacy. This adjustment in priorities can be seen in Mr. Trump's budget proposals, which would lift Pentagon spending by 9% while lowering State Department allocations by 29%. Budget. In addition, the U.S. was the catalyst for a United Nations decision in June to cut its annual peacekeeping outlay by $600 million. And that in turn resulted in a 7.5% reduction in Washington's $2 billion contribution to the UN Blue Helmet's previous yearly budget of nearly $8 billion. The Trump team has also resisted an African Union push for more direct UN funding for the US military mission in Somalia. AMISOM. Washington's opposition to enhancing the UN role in Somalia relates to Mr. Trump's preference for unilateral U.S. decision-making in wars against Islamist forces in Africa. Ambassadors. Mr. Trump has also been slow to fill Africa-related diplomatic posts. He has yet to nominate ambassadors to fill vacancies at U.S. embassies in Tanzania, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo and South Africa. Former President Obama's move to name a U.S. envoy to Somalia for the first time in decades has also been left hanging following the resignation of his appointee in October. Mr. Trump has also eliminated the posts of U.S. Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region and for Sudan, South Sudan. Polish's Donald Yamamoto, a career diplomat with long experience in Africa, was given the State Department's top Africa job on an acting basis in August. But Mr. Yamamoto's announced appointment for no more than a one-year period is causing him to be seen as a temporary figure with little autonomy. And that has resulted in ambassadors acquiring enhanced authority to shape U.S. policies in their respective countries. Raila Odinga complained about this devolution in the case of Kenya during a speech at a Washington think tank on November 9. "We need a much fuller engagement from the many arms of government in Washington rather than leaving Kenya policy mainly to U.S. diplomats in Nairobi," Mr. Odinga declared. "Their efforts have sometimes contributed to the problem," the NASA leader said. All these developments have occurred within the context of Mr. Trump's own lack of attention to, and knowledge of, Africa. In one of his few interactions with Africans since his victory, the president hosted a luncheon for leaders of 9 sub-Saharan countries in September on the sidelines of UN General Assembly meetings in New York. But in his speech, Mr. Trump made reference to the non-existent country of Namibia, and suggested that Africa could serve as a source of riches for so many friends of his. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has exhibited a similar degree of inattention to Africa. In a meeting with State Department employees in August, Mr. Tillerson embarked on a figurative little walk around the world that did not pass through Africa. Growth. Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, has emerged as the leading Trump administration spokesperson on Africa affairs. Ms. Haley, a former state governor, had no previous professional experience in diplomacy. She offered standard Washington rhetoric while undertaking a recent trip to South Sudan and the DRC. "The United States very much sees Africa as a very important part of the world," Ambassador Haley said. "We see great opportunities in Africa, we see challenges in Africa, but we want to support and help in those situations." South Sudan's Haley also delivered familiar messages to the leaders of those countries, saying the U.S. wants the South Sudan government to do more to end a ruinous civil war and telling DRC leader Joseph Kabila to respect democratic norms. Mr. Trump's Africa policy does, in some ways, reflect continuity with the approaches taken by both his Democratic and Republican predecessors. AGOA officials have indicated that the signature Africa-related initiatives of Mr. Obama and George W. Bush, the Power Africa Electrification Project and the PEPFAR Anti-AIDS Program, respectively, will be sustained, though perhaps in somewhat diminished form. Mr. Trump will also not rescind AGOA's preferential trade terms for Africa adopted during Bill Clinton's presidency, U.S. officials have said. But the Republican president apparently intends to take a harder line toward countries deemed to be less than fully compliant with AGOA's stipulations. Rwanda, Tanzania and Uganda are each facing possible loss of AGOA eligibility due to Trump trade officials' contention that they have violated the program's requirements by banning imports of used clothing from the United States.